think we've given everybody time enough to get here, so I'm going to welcome you all. Welcome all those people who are new to come to World of Wildlife. So World of Wildlife started, well, about 3 years ago now, and I started it initially because people were asking questions of me and Dr. Wong, who is the hero and the subject of the books that I write. So it became initially a way for people to ask questions of both of us at the same time. And it's evolved since then to be a monthly meeting of wildlife people around the world who just share our ideas, share our passions, and now have a guest speaker every single month. That guest speaker shares something to do with wildlife around the world. And our guest speaker today is Tyron, who's going to be talking to us about management of bats and people, pretty much. But before he does, I'll give you a bit of an update on what I've been doing. We haven't had a meeting for 2 months, so there's a little bit to go through and tell you what I've been up to, because it's been an amazing couple of months. I'm hoping that Dr. Wong will be here from the Bornean Sun Bear Conservation Centre, and he'll be able to tell you what the latest is in his Sun Bear Centre, and also his satellite centre in Tarban Wildlife Reserve, which he's now moved the second baby sun bear into this satellite area, which is in the middle of the jungle, so that they can do a rehabilitation which is not impacted by human conflict or human interaction. So that sort of will lead us to this concept that we're talking about today with Tyron. But let me start, introduce myself to those of you who are here for the first time, and thank you very much for being here. So the books that I write are all focused on the real life adventures of Dr. Wong and his adventures in Borneo. So I started by writing Saving Sun Bears as my Doctor of Creative Arts degree. That was published in 2020. And then since then, I've written 6 children's books about his adventures with different species. Some of the people in this room, particularly Taylor, has been one of my young reviewers who reviewed one of those books and has her name in her review in one of the books. So thanks again for that, Taylor, for doing that. That's fantastic. Things that I've been doing. So over the Christmas period, I always go to the Woodford Folk Festival. It's a week-long festival of ideas, music, and activities. It's the largest folk music festival in the Southern Hemisphere. And this year I was a performer there. So I did 2 things. One was a talk to adults, which was called The Pen Can Save the World. And in that, we explored the concepts of, first we explored a timeline of books that I think have changed the way that we see the natural world, from the origin of species up to the present. And then we did a bit of a brainstorm and gathered in the audience, we gathered a really awesome list of different books that the audience felt had changed the way they saw the natural world. And lastly, I put out, I guess, a call to action so that people would write letters that could save the world. They write to these 2 politicians. Politicians, for those of you who are not in Australia, you wouldn't know that woman is Tanya Plibersek, our Environment Minister, and the man there is Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister. They wrote letters, and I collected about 40 letters directly to these politicians. And then later you'll see what I did with them. It was fun, though. The second thing I did at Woodford Folk Festival was run one of my most popular workshops, which is called Rainforest in a Jar. So all these young people learned how a rainforest works. They learned about the circular system in a rainforest. They learned about some of the creatures that live there. And then they built a rainforest in a jar, aka a terrarium, and got to take that home with them, which was really fun. And during the week, I had 4 different workshops. We had 130 kids come through that workshop. So it was exhausting and it was absolutely amazing. Absolutely loved every second of that. From there, I headed south, and I headed south to do some research for my next book called Curious Kai. It's a Curious Kai series. Curious Kai is a young girl who goes in search of what she can learn from Australian wildlife to help her save the world. I learned a lot about koalas, and this picture I thought you would get a giggle out of, because this is a Hello Koala. Hello Koala sculptures are in Port Macquarie in New South Wales. Each one is painted by a different artist, and this one is the title of this one is I'm Not a Bear. I thought this was such an awesome thing, and I wish I could turn it around to show you the back of this koala, because it's like it's wearing a panda suit, and it's got a big zipper down its back. It's very, very cool. So if you're in Port Macquarie, you can go on a bit of a tour around Port Macquarie and surrounds looking for these different koalas. It's quite amazing. I also learned about snakes at Mulligan's Flat in the ACT. I went searching for eastern brown snakes and learning all about those. I went in search of bettongs, and actually at night with the researchers at Mulligan's Flat, which is an incredible natural reserve where they're actually trying to solve the ecosystem, put it back to the way it should be by introducing species like curlews and bettongs and New Holland mice and snakes and all sorts of other ones, quolls as well, into this area to actually get the balance the way it should be. Really interesting. I learned a great deal there. I also did a workshop there. So I did the same workshop I did at Woodford. I did the Rainforest in a Jar workshop at the Mulligan's Flat area and got some wonderful, wonderful young people involved in that one. And then I went in search of a few other species. Now this one we're going to hear later, another month we'll hear from Kathy, who runs the Australian Botanical Gardens and Seed Bank, where seeds in Australia that are in danger of extinction are saved. They're actually cryovac. They cryovac seeds, and then they also take seeds and propagate them, and they take cuttings and propagate them. One of their most amazing success stories is this tree, the Wollemi pine, which is an ancient tree which was found in one valley in the middle of the Blue Mountains inland from Sydney, and has now been saved so much that there are actually Wollemi pines planted in botanical gardens around the world, as far north as in Edinburgh and as far south as Wellington. And you can even go into your local hardware store and buy a Wollemi pine. So this is an interesting journey of how to save a species by opening it up and allowing it to be spread more widely. So really interesting story that will be part of the Curious Kai story when I get round to it. All right. I am heading next week after next. I'm heading back to Brunei, to Borneo, to Brunei. I'm going to the Jerong International School in Brunei and doing an entire week of workshops along with the students there. It's their book week, and I'll be doing workshops with every single child in their school during the entire week. So, but the most exciting thing here, I was hoping Wong would be here to share this with you, but the school, once they contacted me and secured me to come to their school for the entire week, the science department actually independently went out and secured Wong to come for an entire day to the same school. So believe it or not, there's a synchronicity happening here, is that on the Friday, Wong will be there for a day and I'll be there for a day, and we'll be doing joint presentations to the school, which is really, well, rather unprecedented. So we're kind of excited about that one. So that's sort of what I've been doing. Any questions on that? How are we going? Pretty good? I don't think we've got Wong, so I think Wong might have had a few potential dramas happening with the bears today. I'm sorry for those of you that have come specifically to talk to Wong. He's not obviously here, but if he does arrive by the time Tyron has finished his talk about bats, then we might pivot and come back to Wong at the end. All right, so I would like to then introduce you to Tyron. So Tyron, are you going to run your own slides? Are you happy doing that?
Yeah, I reckon I can manage that. We'll find out soon enough, I suppose.
Yeah, here we go. So Tyron is going to talk to us about managing human and wildlife conflict using bats as his primary sort of indicator of that. But I'll pass over to Tyron, and thank you so much for being here. So appreciate it.
Not a problem at all, Sarah. Thank you very much. I'll just start to share this and let's see how clever I am. And let's see if we can go this. Here we go. Sharing. Beautiful. We under control here?
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you. Fantastic. That's a great start. Thank you very much. Look, I'm coming here from Cubby Cubby and Yinnaburra land on the beautiful Sunshine Coast. So firstly, I'd like to pay my acknowledgement, my deepest acknowledgement to our First Nations people of Cubby Cubby and Yinnaburra land, and also anyone else across the world who might be of First Nations descent. Very much paying my respect and my acknowledgement to the ongoing knowledge and the care and continuing care for country. We're here talking about conservation more broadly. These people were doing conservation in Australia for millennia. There's tens of thousands of years worth of knowledge, and they've shared that through their generations, and also fortunate enough to share it with us as well. So I deeply hope that I can continue these partnerships with our First Nations people on the Sunshine Coast, and also more broadly to continue that understanding of conservation and caring for our country. Now, I wouldn't be able to sort of talk to you about flying foxes and conflict management without giving you a quick crash course on flying foxes. So for those who aren't aware of flying foxes, I'm going to kind of go between terms here a little bit. So all flying foxes are fruit bats. They're bats that eat fruit. Pretty straightforward. They're also bats. Now, I will also sometimes mention other bats, which are the little smaller echolocating bats that feed on insects, but primarily I'm talking about the fruit bats, these really large ones, and they are quite large. Their torso is about as big as me. They weigh about 1 kilo, and their wingspan can be up to 1.5 meters sometimes, so they are incredibly big. And in Australia, over 1/4 of all native mammals are bats, which I just find incredible because you only kind of concentrate on a few of them, but they're actually really prolific. They're placental mammals just like us, so they give birth same way as we do. A placenta comes out, and they typically only give birth to one individual every year in a really good year. And it takes females about 3 years to get to sexual maturity. So, it does take a bit of time. And even though we see them in large congregations sometimes, people often go, oh, geez, they're in plague proportions. They're everywhere. They must be going out of control. That's not the case. They're actually quite slow in terms of their reproductive cycle. And in the wild here in Australia, due to all the threats, some of them are only living to about 7 or 8 years old. So there's not much fecundity, as we would say, in terms of trying to proliferate their population. And they're the only mammal capable of sustained flight, which is really impressive. Dogs don't fly, cats don't fly, whales don't fly, pigs don't fly, but these guys do. They're capable of moving massive distances, thousands of kilometers across the landscape, all the time spreading seeds and pollinating as they go. Incredible distances. We do in Australia have some marsupials, and we have some other mammals like gliders and things like that they're falling with style, as Woody from Toy Story would say. They're not constantly flying everywhere. So these ones are actually able to lift, take flight, and as mammals, that's incredibly energy dense. Like think about you going every single day and flapping your little arms around to try and get yourself to move from one place to another all day, every day, which is why they're constantly having to have these high energy resources like flowers and nectar. Now, they are from the order of Chiroptera, and as ecologists, we're fairly straightforward folk. We see things and we name them as we see them. So here's a hand that's evolved over 23 million years to become a wing. It's a hand wing, we'll call them Chiroptera. Fairly straightforward stuff. So as you can see with these ones, this is actually their 5 digits on here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor if I move it over here, but this little dude up here, that's its thumb. So just like ours, that's its thumb. They actually use it for a lot of things. It's not just for show. So the males will actually do this when they're boxing each other for territory. They'll have little thumb wars. They get their little thumbs out and have a little wrestle with one another. They also use that as a very, very important job, which is to invert. So when they go to the bathroom, one of the questions I always get asked is, how do they not get mess all over themselves? And it's pretty simple. They've actually got great core strength. So they're hanging upside down, as we would see them. They do themselves a little ab crunch, get themselves up, hook on with their thumbs, let go with their feet, swing back down, do their business, give a little bum shake, making sure all's clean, crunch themselves back up, and away they go. So it has a really important function. But those other digits that we can see, those other 4 that we've got, they are actually very important in terms of how they move. So how they're moving their wrists, they're moving their fingers, they're quite fancy things. So they're just doing jazz hands. That's how they get through the landscape. They're constantly flapping, flipping their fingers, and that's how they're moving through complex ecosystems and through rainforests and just generally flutter feeding as well for some of those microbat species. And the little one that you see at the bottom there, the lovely female there, it's a grey-headed flying fox. Again, we're not very creative. It's a flying fox. It's got a grey head. It's called a grey-headed flying fox. That little girl there, she's actually got a bub on her that you can see as well. So the bubs actually hang onto mum's chest, and she has a teat underneath her armpit. So they'll have a little suckle on the teat underneath the armpit, which you won't be able to see in that photo. But they're just cruising around nonstop with a bub attached to them. And these ones are actually listed as nationally vulnerable to extinction in Australia. So these little critters, they're actually really impressive and they're very important in terms of pollination. So whilst they do get a pretty bad rap sometimes, they have a very important purpose in terms of pollination and seed dispersal. So they're our primary nocturnal pollinators. So they're doing all their busy work at night. They're our FIFO workers. They're out busily flying from here to there, spreading seeds, pollinating forests as they go, whilst we're asleep. So we don't necessarily get to see all their good work. And because they're so large, they pollinate more plants and over a larger distance than birds or insects. With over 600, just think about that number there, 600 species of Australian plants and animals rely on their pollination skills for survival. And over that 23 million years of coevolution, many of our Australian species have actually co-evolved with them to attract flying foxes specifically. So our eucalypt forests, they've actually evolved. So they have sort of creamy colored or white or yellowy colored flowers. So they're easier to see at night. And they actually, about 90% of their pollination is done by flying foxes for some of these species. And they actually open up their stamens and only let nectar out at night. And again, it's to try and attract flying foxes. So it's this synergy that they have within the landscape, knowing that this is the best way to connect those large fragmented spaces of forest that we have across Australia, is to attract these large fauna and flying foxes to try and connect it. Before the commercial agriculture industry as well, we had bananas solely pollinated by flying foxes and bats, which is, again, a remarkable issue that I wouldn't have had brekkie this morning if we didn't have flying foxes. Cacao, so we wouldn't have chocky either, one of my big food groups. And most importantly, the blue agave is solely pollinated by a small insectivorous bat. So without bats, we would have no blue agave, which means we would have no tequila, no Friday nights, no good times. And that is just absolutely criminal that we couldn't do without bats for. So very, very important roles that they play rather. So how does it actually work? Well, great question. I'm happy to answer that for you. Now, bats fly around at night. As I said, so we've got this beautiful little bat here flying from place to place. She's going into that plant there to have a bit of a feed. You can see in that bottom picture there, that's actually a grey-headed flying fox. So she's supposed to be a grey colour, but she is beautifully yellow because she has just dived face deep into that golden pender, and all of the pollen is stuck to her face, all over her chest, all over her belly, and it's just sticking to that fur so strongly. She then flies to the next flower, and this is a before and after photo of the same individual, believe it or not. She's then happily just cruising around that next golden pender, having a feed, covered in stamen. She's having the time of her life. And so every time they're moving around the landscape, they are constantly cross-pollinating. And they're doing that sometimes up to 50 or 60 kilometers every single night, and dozens of different plants that they're going and cross-pollinating between. Now, they're our little nature's caravanners, as I like to refer to them. Now, I'll press this map to start going in a second. And before I do that, I'll just explain this was actually a tracking project done by the University of Western Sydney. So they actually put cute little collars, little tracking collars on 201 flying foxes, and they tracked them for up to 5 years. And sometimes some of them went over 5 years. And each of these dots that you'll see moving around a second is one single flying fox. So you get to see how far they actually move when they're flying. So look at how far they're going. Now, it's easy to think when we go to a site and we see tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of flying foxes in a space, that's where they are. That's where they live. They come back there, they fly out at night, and then they come back to the exact same spot. But that's not the case. They're acting like kind of backpacker hostels, if you will, and they're constantly moving between the landscape. So think of this like an airport, if you will, where if you went into a busy international airport, if I was a bat and I went in there and I looked around and went, oh my goodness, there's a plague of people here. Look at them. There's thousands of people. They're everywhere. They're as far as the eye can see. They're noisy. They're smelly. Get rid of them all. And then I go away and I come back into the next day and I look in the same airport and I go, oh my goodness, look, there's thousands of them still. They're all the same. They're still noisy. They're still smelly. Let's get rid of them. But the reality is when you look at that same place, a lot of the people have turned over. They're itinerant. They're going and coming. This is just a node where they're going from. And there's realistically only a small number of people who are staying at that airport, the people that work there. It's similar to flying foxes. So they have a lot of these little nodes up and down the east coast of Australia and across into South Australia as well, where they're constantly moving in between and they're always responding to either climatic conditions or to flowering patterns. But they are moving extremely large distances during that time. So to illustrate that point a bit better, here is the National Flying Fox Monitoring Program. So the reason why I chose back in 2018 was because this was before our Black Summer bushfires. So that was a large series of bushfires that devastated a lot of the country and moved through New South Wales and Victoria and basically removed about 30% of their feeding habitat. So obviously they've had to pivot a little bit. They've had to kind of change what they do since 2019, but because they're capable of flying such large distances, they've adapted fairly well, which is great. So as you can see here, the different times of year between May and between November, between their mating season and between their birthing season, this is for grey-headed flying foxes, their range has changed dramatically. And the darker the area there means the higher the concentration of animals. So this obviously correlates to different types of plants being in flower at the time. So during May, it's a lot of our lovely paperbark trees, a larger range. They're spreading themselves around, lots of things to feed on as a grey-headed flying fox. And then during those, just getting into summer then, the range is really restricted because it's a different flowering pattern as well, and different species are flowering at the same time. So they've changed and adapted to their needs. At the same token, to give a far more dramatic example of it, here are the little red flying foxes. Now, these ones are capable of flying exceptional distances, and they come in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even up to 2 million almost overnight in some instances. So they are extremely large populations. They move en masse, and they're incredibly nomadic. So during that same time period, they've got a flipped ecology. So their birthing seasons opposite essentially to the grey-headed flying foxes. Their birthing season, they will spread out a little bit more throughout Queensland, a bit throughout central Queensland as well. But then you can see them concentrated into like 4 or 5 sites exclusively during November that same year. So a really restricted range. And again, it's because there's peak flowering. They've got their preferred foods. So for these guys, it's usually bloodwoods flowering, and they have honed in on a spot and gone, this is exactly where all the bloodwoods are flowering. This is exactly where we're going to go. We're going to hit them, and they're only going to be here for a couple of months, and then they take off to move to another place. So really tricky because they're constantly moving. Now, I've kind of gone on about the importance of flying foxes and their ecological role and how important they are in pollination, but why do we manage human-wildlife conflict then? And obviously for people who aren't from Australia, they might not have this same sort of perspective and see the same sort of issues that we have here. Now, these are animals that are largely doing their business at night. They can sometimes be quite disruptive in terms of, having a bit of a chatter or a fight or otherwise just fighting for territory as they're pollinating during the night and having a feed. But when they come back during the day, it's typically when they're at their most impactful. So these guys are coming back at dawn, sometimes a little bit before it. So in Southeast Queensland right at the moment. It's about 4:30 in the morning that they're flying back in en masse to a new roost site. And that's when they're battling for territory as well. The boys are boxing each other. They're trying to search for mates. So there's a lot of stuff happening in a space early on in the morning, which can be quite disruptful. These are also really, really serious issues. So I'm certainly not here because I get dozens of requests every single day from my community saying how impactful it is. So I'd be naive in saying that there weren't any issues or that they were minor, because they are really significant to some people. And the noise being certainly one of them. And odor, they do a lot of scent marking this time of year as well. So it is quite a pungent aroma, but it's kind of like, how some people can taste coriander and some people say it tastes awful and some people say it tastes lovely. It's the same sort of thing where there's sort of individual nuance with odor, that some people are really, really responsive to it and really sensitive to it. People like myself, very fortunate, don't really smell it at all. Probably wouldn't have lasted long in the industry if I was against it. So I'm perk of the trade, let's say. So for some people, it's really impactful. This has led to really serious issues. So things like lack of sleep, especially for people who do shift work, breakdowns in relationships, suicidal ideologies, people trying to live in their cars to get away from the noise and the smell. So really legitimate concerns here. And so we are actually in a space where we're trying to balance conservation outcomes for a threatened species with really severe and quite serious social impacts. So it's a really nuanced space and it's really complex. So how do we navigate that? Now, on top of this, a lot of people have what's called a narrative of fear. So flying foxes, yes, they've been deeply ingrained in this sort of narrative for hundreds of years. So things like Dracula, the portrayal of vampires, those sorts of things really haven't helped, where people should be fearful of bats and fearful of the night. And there's all this mystery and they're awful, evil creatures. So a lot of that fear has subconsciously been planted in. And I'm not an epigeneticist, so I'm going to speak very vaguely on epigenetics, but there is a thing called social learning theory, where this has actually been shown that passing on these experiences through your sort of nature versus nurture situation here, through your social interactions, has actually led to a fundamental change in the DNA of offspring. So those intergenerational and transgenerational traumas and fears have been passed on through generations, which means that, that negative impact and that really heavily ingrained narrative of fear through our parents and our grandparents and generations previous has kind of solidified over time. And as we know, when people are, conversing and people are learning through their conspecifics and their parents, etc., they learn through observation. And when they see these fears come out from other people, they inherently become fearful of it. And in terms of this social behavior or social learning theory, mental states are really important to learning. And this is something you've probably seen in your education as well, is that you have to kind of feel it. You have to be in a good place to be able to take on new information, and just learning facts and figures is not necessarily going to lead to any sort of behavior change, which is a little bit counterintuitive. And obviously me coming up here and just talking lovely facts about flying foxes is also a little bit counterintuitive, because you might not necessarily be in the space that you want to learn more about them. And that's often what happens with some of these residents that are really heavily impacted. They don't want to hear how important they are. They just want to know, how are you going to help me, Tyron? So how do we shift that narrative? Well, as a wise woman once told me, my lovely gran, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. Nothing's ever going to change. And we've been trying to scare away flying foxes for 120 years and it hasn't worked. We've been bashing pots and pans, firecrackers, lighting fires underneath them, all sorts of things to try and get rid of them. And it's never worked. So yeah, we can come up with some of these new solutions. There's lots of lovely new solutions that I'll kind of touch on here as well. Very lovely ways of going about it. But if we're looking at it the same way and we're looking at this same problem and all these new solutions aren't working, perhaps it's not the solutions that are the problem. Perhaps the problem's the problem. And to that I mean, perhaps we're not asking the right questions or we're not framing it in the right way. So how do we move from this narrative where bats equal bad? Bats are bad, they're awful, my goodness, you should be fearful of them. Oh, okay, in that case, I'm going to tell you how good they are, how important they are, and then you're just inherently going to love them. And if it doesn't work, well, then I just need to tell you more, and eventually I'll bash you over the head with the facts, and you'll see the same thing as me. That's not necessarily how it works. So how do we change this narrative to instead be that coexistence is really tricky? Now, inherently, that then reframes it as well, because it's sort of both parties have a shared interest in this, and they both have a shared responsibility in trying to manage this. That, yeah, it can be tricky, and those things are noisy and smelly sometimes, but there's something I can do about it on my side as well. I'm part of this management process. I'm empowered. I have agency to be able to change my mind about this. And sometimes it is tricky like in any relationship, sometimes you don't get along all the time. So how do we do that? Well, firstly, we educate people and try and engage with them. So this is that learning part that I mentioned at the beginning. So we do that we have our monthly monitoring. So all those in that second photo there, those lovely dots on the map, we actually have staff members that go out every single month and monitor each roost. So the very first photo that you can see is the footprint. So you can actually go in and we count every single animal that's there, ideally, and all the information's there. You can see exactly what's happening and get a landscape picture of how dynamic they are, where they're moving across the space, within the space, across the region, across the country, to get a better understanding of how dynamic this species is. Have our sort of standard things like your board games and your interp signage, and our beautiful mascot, Frankie the Flying Fox as well, that goes out to lovely events and helps spread the word of flying foxes as well. But I did say that speaking facts doesn't necessarily lead to behavior change, because you've got to be in that mental state for it. So here's how we then change that a little bit as well and try and go into spaces where people are already comfortable, or bring them to a space where they're going to be more comfortable to try and take on those new messages. So things like our Teacher's Guide, which is our education program. So that's basically empowering all of our teachers with units of study. So things that they can do to learn about flying foxes, that's curriculum aligned. So they can actually thread it through their learnings and their teachings to the students about how important flying foxes are at different age groups and in different subjects. I have an audio tool, so for people who can't get to a site, or if they want to have less of an ecological footprint, you can download that app, listen to some beautiful sounds of a flying fox roost, and learn some facts about flying foxes as well. Our hands-on tours as well, so guided tours with ecologists, with First Nations partners to actually, there's nothing better than connecting with them and seeing them in person to learn to protect them. And get that beautiful connection and ask all the questions with the experts. And then our Bat Pod, which is our Choose Your Own Adventure podcast. So like the old Goosebumps books, if you ever had those, we'd go up to a point and go, oh, do I want to go left or right? Flick through pages. Oh, yeah, page 13. Oh, sorry, you fell down a hole. I'm going to go back and try that again. Same sort of scenario, but a novel concept with a podcast where you're actually in my role for the day, going alongside with me, and you get to make the decisions on how you would manage a situation with an urban flying fox roost. Now, we just sprinkle in a little bit of innovation with that as well. So these things are those sort of value adds. They're those solutions, those things that I said that might be really lovely and novel ways to approach it. So that sprinkler that you see there, the humble sprinkler, in this instance, it's actually used as a deterrent. So it's something that we give as an option to some residents that are right next to a flying fox roost, and actually empowers them. So it's your average off-the-shelf field sprinkler that you'd see at your school ovals, sort of ones, but we've installed it up in the canopy. And what it does, it only operates for about 30 to 45 seconds, and it goes on a couple of times during the day, and it shoots out that jet of water. And the water itself doesn't impact the flying foxes. They're outside every single day. They're out in storms, they're out in cyclones. They couldn't care less about being wet. But what it does do is that short period of time that it's on, it's hitting the leaves, it's hitting the branches, it's making a rustle, it's making a sound, and it's replicating something moving really quickly through the canopy. So it would be like a carpet python or a goanna or something coming up from underneath to try and grab a flying fox. And what they do in response is they actually just lift themselves up, because they're so clever and because they're able to do it, fly back about 20 meters and reperch themselves in and settle their roost down a little bit further away from people. So we're not trying to get rid of them from the landscape, because it would be naive in thinking that we could, because we can't. They move. They're wild animals. They do whatever they please, unfortunately, sometimes, but that's how they work. But trying to empower people to be able to have a bit of a deterrent and a bit of a power to try and shuffle them back just a little bit further. Now, top one that we've got there is our odor neutralizing trial. So it's something that was such a fun little trial, and something that I'll never forget being a part of. So that beautiful big machine there that you've got, there's a little container next to it. There's a little liquid in it. And what that liquid does, it vaporizes in that machine and goes through those two black tubes that you can see up the top. So it's just corrugated plastic tubing, but it's got little holes in the bottom of it. And when it's been vaporized, it's like a big vaporizer that you'd have at home if you have, have a cold or a flu or a dehumidifier. And it just ekes that treatment. And what that liquid was, it was actually specially formulated at a lab. And they actually identified the odor molecules of flying foxes and flying foxes alone. And it grabs onto those odor molecules and neutralizes them. So it's not going to work if there's ibis or if there's rubbish or if there's sewage or whatever else, but it will neutralize the flying fox odor. So it's something, again, that empowers these people, because obviously they said noise and smell are really impactful things. It's not really a lot we can do about stopping smell in an open landscape. So maybe there's something that we can do to try and neutralize those odors on people's properties. So this was a really interesting one, because I got to partner with people who were professional sniffers. I didn't even realize that was a job before now. They actually went there with a big vacuum bag and caught some buckets of air. And they'd be there like a sommelier. So they're sitting there and, oh yes, this is a lovely Sunshine Coast air pocket. Yeah, it's a 96 white. They actually smelled the components and went, oh no, this is really impactful, or no, the odor is being neutralized. And so they were actually able to identify that the odor was being neutralized, which is just incredible things that we can be trialing here. But I appreciate my time is running out, so I won't labor on these any further. I'm happy to address questions as well. But if you wanted to see any of those resources a bit closer, feel free, snap a QR code. You're welcome to go and have a look at them, grab any of those resources. These are things that are all publicly available, because the intention of this is that everything I do is publicly available, so we can have that conversation around, is this being done well or not? And for those who are in Australia, please feel free to be involved. Submit a sighting on Bats in Backyards. So it's iNaturalist, which is an app that a lot of you might be using already. What we're wanting to find out is what flying foxes are feeding on, so that we know both what we can plant to encourage them to go to places, but also, if you don't want them in your backyard, what do you avoid planting? And I empower you. Be the voice in the community. Spread the word, share the resources, spread the little facts, because the reality is I'm just some random guy from the council. And if people have questions and they want to grill someone, they're not necessarily going to listen to me. But those Sunday barbecues that you have, those different social outings when someone pops up a thing, oh my goodness, those bats, they're awful, aren't they? Hopefully you have a little bit of information now that I've imparted on you, that you can just sprinkle through again, and you've been equipped to try and have those conversations, and slowly we can shift that narrative. They're never going to go from 0 to 100, but maybe we can kind of shift that narrative. And feel free, be part of the conversation. Feel free to leave some feedback as well. I do have 3 very short questions in terms of how we can do flying fox management better. And I'd love to always harness information and opinions from other people around the world as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate all of your time, and appreciate Sarah for inviting me along. Thank you.
Wow, that was fabulous. Thank you so much, Tyron. I just that was even better than I'd have ever imagined. So thank you so much. I'm going to put us back to the gallery and ask the questions. But while you're thinking about your questions, guys, I want to a couple of things that I made notes of while you were talking. And I think the most important thing is the innovation that you're using, Tyron, is using all sorts of different innovations to handle this human wildlife conflict. And that conflict doesn't just happen with bats. That conflict happens around the world with all sorts of different species, doesn't it? So I know, like in Borneo, we've got conflicts with bears, we've got conflicts with elephants. You've got, you know, all around the world there's conflicts, and just that concept of being innovative and coming up with ideas of ways that we can live better together, whether it be bats or something else, I think is just a mind shift, really, and it's a mind shift that we need everywhere. So thank you so much. Even though there's many of our people here aren't in Australia and they might not see a flying fox for a while, it's appropriate for every single ecology, I think, in the world. Yeah. Who's got a question for Tyron?
Hi. Sorry, excuse me. I was paying attention. Tell me, where did your love of bats come from?
Oh, great question. I honestly don't think I've ever been asked that question, which is wild to think that I've been working with bats for, I think, 8 years now, and no one's ever asked me why I love them and where they came around. I think it was by accident, honestly. So I've come from the veterinary industry. That's where I did a lot of my work. I was working in the industry for about 12 years. Had a bit of an epiphany moment one time working at the Australia Zoo Wildlife Hospital. It was quite literally a 3 a.m. epiphany as I was on shift. And I had that was sort of my first exposure to flying foxes and understanding them, because they, to me as well, were really foreign. Working primarily with birds, there was this thing like that. They just seemed like they were all limbs. There was things everywhere. They moved in a different way that was unfamiliar to me. But I think it was just honestly not just knowledge sharing from others about their importance, and their beautiful faces. That's really the connection. Was I can see why some ecologists way back when called them flying foxes, because they have this beautiful face that looks like a fox. Or, you know, a lot of people here will call them sky puppies because they look like puppies. They're so cute. They're incredibly intelligent. They have really highly adapted and really complex social interactions as well. So the ability to sit and, I'm monitoring sites, you're kind of in and amongst them, and you get to see them, and you see that interplay between them. They're having their little box. You can kind of come up with the narrative in your head. You're like, oh, get out of my tree. What are you doing here? Oh no, that's my girlfriend. Da, 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 da. And you can watch them interact, and it's yeah, I think it's just time and connection. So I was really fortunate to have had that ability to be close to them and see them, and a willingness to want to learn more and engage more with them, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing. Thank you. Really, really good talk.
Thank you.
Good answer. Meryl, I know you've got something you want to talk about your bats, I'd imagine.
On my bats, yes. 4 o'clock, 4:30 every morning they come home and sit right on the dot at 7 they leave. I'm opposite the back of the high school at Maroochydore.
Oh, right.
So I've got lots of them there, and they are cyclic. Like a few years ago, I was really worried about how few there were, but this season there's thousands.
Yeah. I'd be really interested to chat to you outside of this, Meryl, because we don't have eyes on the high school one there.
All right.
Because it's not our land, so we're not able to go on there. So I'd be
Yeah, well,
really keen to.
I haven't ever seen anyone going there looking at them, but I used to raise and release wildlife, and particularly flying foxes. And I've got a friend here, Chris, who wants to ask a question.
I'll go for it.
Hi, I'm Meryl's friend. Great talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I've been doing it for a long time too, and I know I'm very aware of the conflict in the population, which is kind of, I may be cynical, it's kind of going to keep occurring. So is there anything being done with town planning? Because we do know that flying foxes camps usually are on like a river or a road, or, you know, there's certain components that we could actually in the future say, well, this may be a flying fox camp with the developments that's occurring everywhere on the East Coast, and we could put like a little ring around it so that we don't have housing close by. Is anything being done with town planning for the future?
That is a fantastic question. And short answer is yes and no. to be wonderfully political and sit on the fence. So yes, at a local level, yes. So we have had the fortune of having University of Sunshine Coast next door to us. So we've been working alongside them, engaged them to do some modelling for us. So they actually have done some modelling and identified the suitable habitat for roosting across the Sunshine Coast region. They've been asked to replicate that as well for other regions across Southeast Queensland in particular. With that knowledge, we have used that to talk with our strategic planners and people who are writing, for instance, the planning scheme, and identified areas that we know is as highly suitable habitat for flying foxes. And now that cuts kind of both ways. What we do with that information is identify areas that are outside of the urban footprint that are highly suitable, and see if that can be protected, conserved, whether it be acquired, whatever it happened to be. But that's a layer of complexity to go, okay, here is really highly suitable habitats, low conflict, likely not to be in the urban footprint, etc. How do we try and encourage flying foxes there naturally? And how do we protect that part of it? And then the other side of it is a bit of a sort of risk recognition as well. It's like, yes, this is potentially a little bit of a social issue and it's a bit of a natural hazard if it were. So being transparent with the community and saying, yes, we have risks here, which is what that modelling and that mapping that I showed through there as well, is identifying sites where flying foxes exist. In terms of the preventing future development, that's where it gets a bit trickier. And not for lack of want or lack of trying. I've certainly been shaking that tree for a while now. But the way in which the planning works is that often these things have been, because those planning schemes are only updated every 10 years, and then the SEQ plan as well every 10 years, often these things get a big circle put around them at the state level and go, okay, all of this area, you need to put in 50,000 homes, figure it out. And we have a little bit of maneuverability to be able to go, oh, we want to go here, here, or here. But sometimes we don't have that flexibility. And outside of that, it's really on the fact that they're updated so infrequently, which is, it's the nature of the beast. It would be too big a thing to try and change planning every single year. Is that a lot of these approvals can sometimes be 10 or further years old. And the approvals are done of what is the law, what are the rules right now. And unfortunately, 6, 7, 8 years later, we have all of this beautiful research and literature and understanding that we then go, this is the priority, this is how we prevent it. But we don't have an ability to be able to go back and change those ones retrospectively, unfortunately. So yes, it's certainly something. And for me, I feel it's a bit of a due diligence. This would be transparency from us. If we identified these places, it's having an understanding of that conflict and going, yes, I acknowledge that this could be a conflict. And also a bit of a buyer beware for some people who don't want to live next door to flying foxes, that they know that they don't want to live there. So they avoid those places.
Whereas I buy a house there.
Yeah. Oh, I live in Curramundi, which is, cubby for place of the bat. So I'm certainly in a beautiful place. I've got a flying fox roost 800 meters south of me and about 1 kilometer north of me. So, I'm one of those people who wouldn't mind it, but it's just one of those tricky beasts within the complexities of the planning structures.
Awesome. Jenny, you're itching with a question.
A comment and a question. The comment is a little bit in reverse. So I live at Rosewood, which is west of Ipswich. Ipswich has a very high flying fox population, but Rosewood never has had any until just this season. And we're wondering if, because there's been a lot of planting in an arboretum and along a gully, Mason's Gully, there's been a lot of regeneration of the original rosewood scrub in this area, whether that's sort of attracting them that we've never had before. And the other thing is, you haven't mentioned anything about viruses and the fear of people. And that's one thing that's quite common around this area about the Lissa virus.
Absolutely. So I'll address the first one. And you're probably correct in some instances of that. I can't speak for it, obviously. Don't work for Ipswich Council, so I'm not privy to what they've done and whether it is attracting them or not. What I would also say is wildlife, and outside of flying foxes as well, they see the landscape in a far different way than we do, and their perspective of recency doesn't really work with our generational knowledge. So we might look at it and go, they haven't been here in 20 years. They haven't been here in my time here. They haven't been here in my lifetime or my parents' lifetime, which means this is a new thing. However, their sort of site fidelity and their understanding and use of the landscape might be multiple generations, and they might see different features. So the sort of analogy that I often give in this instance is kind of like a farmer spelling a paddock. So rotational grazing as they go around different sites, if you've ever done anything with farming. So these sites, although they seem separate for us, and we've put arbitrary lines on a map, or we've put roads and things in between them, for flying foxes and for other wildlife, this is just small obstacles in the way of a bit larger patch, and they use it as a larger patch. So it might be that they see Moreton Bay, Ipswich, Brisbane, and Sunshine Coast as one really big patch, but they move between those small little nodes. And it might be even between Rosewood and the other site that you're talking about. It might be that that was historically one large patch of vegetation. And by historically, I mean pre-European colonization. This could be something that in their intergenerational conversations that they're having as flying foxes, and they've passed on their knowledge of where to feed, what's in flower, those sorts of things.
That's
perhaps that conversation is a larger.
Yeah, Rosewood, the Rosewood scrub area was the largest brigalow scrub in the world back pre-settlement. So
yeah, right.
Yeah, that might be it.
It could well be. And it's, you know, we have, and for the people who are in Maroochydore as well, like we have, I think it's 13 sites around sort of Maroochydore, Mooloolaba, Kunda Park, Kaluan. Realistically, they probably just see that as one patch, and they move between all those tiny little sites, and, you know, they'll have a bit of a go of it. Some of the vegetation will degrade, and so they just spell that paddock, move on to the next one. And while that first one regenerates, they're moving between each of those different little satellite nodes until they get back. But their timescale is just different to ours. That's all. The second one about the viruses, yeah, really strong point. Yes, it is certainly a concern that a lot of people have. Public health is certainly something that is an issue with this. One of the positives is no touch and you're pretty much cruising, which is great. A lot of these viruses are passed on through direct contact by being scratched or bitten. So if you don't pick them up, you don't cuddle them, happy days. There is no evidence to say that there is any greater risk of bacterial infection through their urinal feces than there is for any other wild animal. So, you know, it would be the same as handling dog droppings, for instance. With that small number, around 1% of the population have been identified as carrying Australian battliciovirus. However, it's essentially asymptomatic. We can't tell by grossly looking at two different individuals whether one has it or one doesn't. So the blanket is, let's just not touch any of them because you can't tell the difference. Yes, they have been linked with other viruses as well. On the flip side of that, they've also been studied quite closely in human medicine because they have this ability to have, you know, to be linked with some of these viruses, but they themselves never suffer from them or very rarely suffer from them. So they're kind of being looked at in some human medicine circles as, you know, a bit of a fountain of youth. And is there an ability? So for instance, flying foxes don't seem to get neoplasias or cancers. So what is it about their ecology and their physiology that is preventing them from getting cancers? So there's a bit of a well to be dipping into here in terms of human medicine and kind of flipping that script again to go, well, there's a lot of other things and anti-aging type things that we're looking at here. And, you know, something so small doesn't usually live 20 years. Things like mice only live for a year, yet we've got echolocating bats that are sometimes as big as your thumb or smaller that live for 20 years. So why are they so long-lived if they're so small? So there's certainly some nuances in that health concern field, but I'm certainly not a wildlife health expert or a virologist, so I'm certainly not going to venture into the nuances of it.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I've got one from one of our usual members who's unable to be here, Barbara. Would like you to expand on the idea of renewables and bats, and specifically the idea of wind farms and bat and bird strike. So how do we transition, for instance, to renewables without harming our wildlife? And should there be I guess that consideration whenever we put wind farms in place?
Oh man, I wish I was well qualified to be able to answer that one properly. So I'm going to give you a really wavy answer because I simply don't know enough to say unequivocally this is the answer. What little I do know, because I primarily work on flying foxes, so the big ones, the big fruit bats, as opposed to the echolocating bats. What I do know is within that industry, it's certainly something that is being prioritized. My personal belief is, yes, we should have an acknowledgement of the impacts, both positive and negative, of wind farms in particular on Australian wildlife, and we should have considerations in them. I know the industry is looking at that, and there's many consultancies around the country that are tasked with specifically that. It's not necessarily the driving force because, and it's the same in the airport industry as well, is bird strikes and bat strikes mean millions of dollars worth of equipment gets broken, which for the companies means loss of profits, loss of revenue, or, planes dropping out of the sky, which is worst case scenario. So they're certainly looking at it in terms of a hazard reduction because that's their best interest. I'm looking at it through an ecological lens. We're trying to achieve the same outcome. So I think regardless of how we look at it, yes, it's something that should be prioritized and certainly is. I am familiar with some mechanisms, for instance, that there are certain times of the day where the wind blades are stopped or slowed, and programming that in. For instance, at the dawn and dusk fly in and fly out would be a logical time for flying foxes. There's other bird species, migratory bird species as well, that they're looking into the impacts of those, and the ability to have, I think I remember this correctly, there is some sort of way in which there's technology where either the blades themselves or an operator, I'm not sure, are able to sense when a flock of something or an individual is coming close, and the blades will slow down in their cycle momentarily, ideally to allow said thing to go through and not get hit, and then move up again.
That would be fabulous, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think the short answer is it doesn't really matter how we attack it.
Yeah, technology can be very helpful. There's
Absolutely.
other really interesting things happening that I found when I was in North Queensland. For instance, the guys at Tolga Bat Hospital, Jenny is working with barbed wire fence alternatives, that help stop fence strikes, which is kind of cool. So it's nice to see that there are innovations happening. Yeah. Any last questions for Tyron? I know we've gone over time, so if anyone's got a pressing question, now's a good time to bring it up.
I don't want to hijack it all.
Go for it, Meryl.
I just wondering, with that odor thing you said was a trial, is that going to progress?
Great question. I was really hoping it wouldn't come up. Probably not at this stage. It may in the future. The main reason was that it was under-recognized, the social component of these sorts of research trials, because it's quite a subjective thing. So a lot of this was done with people who are nearby a site, which was selected with specific criteria and identified that the equipment itself wasn't going to have any off-target impacts on the roost itself or any other wildlife, because obviously a lot of wildlife use scent for marking and things like that. So we tidied up the ecology to make sure, yep, it's not going to have any impacts on the animals. Then surveyed the local residents around there, you know, they were getting daily little check sheets to say if they could smell it or not. They were getting a weekly phone interview as well to say, hey, how are you feeling about this? What did you see over the week? Da, 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 da. It was a blind study as well to ensure that they weren't aware whether the system was on or off. Then we had 30,000 little red flying foxes turn up at that place. And again, it was just that social component of kind of what I touched on a little bit is everything else kind of goes out the window when there's some sort of catastrophe, so to speak, plonked in front of you. So even when they left after 13 days, the people were so sort of traumatized, for lack of a better term, that carried on a bias through their reporting. So they would still say, yes, the impact's awful, it's catastrophic, I'm still smelling them, there's droppings everywhere, da 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 da. So it very much biased the research trial. So it's unfortunate that those things happen, but it is a social component. We're doing social science here, really, and trying to harbor information from people. And that's sometimes, strangely enough, it's easier to work with wildlife than people. But
Not in that case.
yeah, so sometimes it's probably not something we'll go into again in the short term, but it's something perhaps we'll see if there's a way that we can ensure that the same level of scientific, sort of robust scientific design exists, but allows for consistency in terms of that social component.
Okay, and I'm happy for Sarah to hand over my details to you because I'd love to get involved again with flying foxes.
Sounds great. I can see all the lovely decor in there as well, the beautiful one that's flying up there.
Ready to go.
Yeah,
And we can hear the camp.
beautiful.
With the music in the background with the flying foxes chattering.
Beautiful. That sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Are you happy for me to pass on your details, or would you like to pass them on in the chat or anything like that? Or
No,
Happy
you
for you
can
to
pass them on.
okay,
Yeah.
I'll pass on if you're happy with that.
Yeah.
I have learned so much today, and I know that we all have. There's some incredible things. I think what you're doing is, as you've sort of mentioned there, Tyron, is social ecology, if there's such a thing. You're just two species together and trying to figure out how we can work together. And those sort of innovations that you're using can be used as illustrations everywhere and utilized elsewhere. So I want to reiterate to people that the resources you've talked about are open access on most of them. The Bat Pod is absolutely fantastic for those of you that are in education. The Bat Pod podcast is an incredible classroom resource or group project resource, which I've gone through and laughed my way through half of it and loved it. It's just brilliant. So definitely those of you in education, do that or pass it on to people you know in education. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much for being here this month. I will make this video available for everybody, so it'll be on my YouTube channel, it'll be available on social media as well, so feel free to share it and feel free to welcome other people into this little group here as well for our next month. I won't tell you yet who the speaker is going to be because it's not 100% certain, but it's pretty close. All right, so enjoy. Thank you, Tyron, so much for being here. Thank you, everybody else. We'll see you soon.
Kindly.